So next we have Jehan Sparks, who is a third-year PhD student in the psychology department here at UC Davis. She has master's degrees in psychology and economics from UC Davis as well, and a BA in economics and philosophy from Columbia University. She has co-authored the American Psychological Association's book chapter on research methods, which is currently in press now. She also has several manuscripts in preparation that address methodological issues in social psychology, which include the discovery of moderating variables in a programmatic set of studies and a simulation project assessing the trade-offs associated with the flexible use of covariates in experimental data. She's going to talk to us today about some challenges we face in the social sciences and what she and her team here have done to address these successfully. Thank you. We can welcome her.
Okay, thanks for having me. So I'm here today to talk to you about the StartLocal approach to developing better research practices. So as we all know, recent years have witnessed a broad movement to try to improve methods and practices across the social sciences and beyond. There's been a lot of commotion across scientific disciplines in fields like psychology, political science, economics, and biomedicine, all in an effort to better understand the scope of our methodological troubles. And researchers have identified a host of methodological problems relevant across the social sciences. For example, something we've heard a lot about today, conducting data-dependent analyses. So this may look very different depending on your discipline. For example, in political science, where you often know about your data set ahead of time, because, for example, you know how election results have turned out. So data-independent analyses may not be possible. In experimental research, this might look like tailoring your analysis to your data. And in medicine, this could look like choosing which subgroups to examine after first looking at your data and noticing an interesting pattern for one subgroup but not another, like for men but not for women. So it turns out that when we do things like this, our p-value doesn't mean what we think it means. It's not strong evidence in favor of our hypothesis. And researchers have identified a host of, Researchers have identified other issues, other problems, things like measurement error in independent variables in regression analysis. Now, this is a problem that econometricians have known about for decades, but it's finally gaining more attention in other disciplines. And issues related to statistical power. So fields are now becoming aware of the importance of properly powering our studies for issues related to both type 1 and type 2 errors. And classic power analyses are often overly optimistic. So accompanying these problems has been a ton of advice or strategies to help researchers tackle these issues head-on. So let's just take one problem that's broadly relevant to most of us in this room: conducting data-dependent analyses. So some advice suggests conducting a pre-registered replication of data-dependent findings. Other advice suggests analyzing and reporting all relevant comparisons rather than just focusing on the ones that hit statistical significance. And yet other advice suggests distinguishing between exploratory and confirmatory work in a pre-analysis plan. So there is a lot of advice out there. How do we figure out what is most relevant for our discipline? How do we know which piece of advice is something that we, in particular, should focus on? So the average researcher's response to all of this advice might understandably be to freeze. If experts can't agree on the best way forward, why should I change my research practices? So what we've done in our lab, which is an experimental psychology lab here at Davis, is something that we call the StartLocal approach. So we started where we actually have good expertise in our own lab and worked from the ground up to build better practices. Now, this approach is continuously evolving, but it was grown in lab meetings and journal clubs here on campus. And the outcome of this approach is going to be different from one lab or one group of graduate students to another, but I think the process of this approach is really relevant to all of us and useful to share. So the first step in this process was that we learned about and critically evaluated new and newly rediscovered statistical techniques and methods. In lab meetings and journal clubs, you could do this in classes or in brown bags or seminars. We asked ourselves, given what we now know about these new and newly rediscovered techniques and topics. So for us, this was things like power, p-hacking, sequential analyses, which is a technique that allows you to stop and look at your data at planned a priori interim analysis points without inflating your type 1 error rate, and the benefits and drawbacks of using online samples, so things like Amazon's Mechanical Turk. What makes us confident in our results? In other words, when do we trust our own findings a lot versus more tentatively? So the second step in this process is that we took what we'd learned and we began to develop a set of shared and still evolving better practices for our lab. So we asked ourselves questions like, what maximizes the information we get from our work? What are our resource constraints? And what's comfortable and feasible for us to start doing right now? So power is a big concern for our research, and so we take care to think about sample sizes. So here's just one example of some of our thinking about sample sizes. As a lab, we've decided that we will set target cell sizes ahead of time. We conduct power analyses whenever possible that are based on previous findings. We do meta-analyses of relevant effect size estimates from the literature. And we consider doing more sophisticated power analyses that take into account things like effect size heterogeneity and publication bias. Now, the third step in this process was that as a lab, we have tried to adopt what we call a gain frame attitude toward our work. In other words, a positive attitude. So our thinking has shifted from viewing methodological issues as problems or threats, and inconvenient at best, something that we need to explain away, to viewing them as critically informative clues to help us be better data detectives. So when we learn, for example, that classic power analyses tend to be overly optimistic, we think maybe we can develop more accurate estimates. Or when we learn that optimal stopping tends to inflate type 1 error rates, we think maybe we can stop without doing this. So this attitude toward our work makes us more open to tackling methodological problems head-on. And these new practices have increased our reliability in our results. And so when we see something unexpected, it becomes an opportunity for us to increase our understanding of psychological phenomena. So the fourth step in this process is that we tried to create an infrastructure to make all of this easy for us. So as social psychologists, we understand that the human mind tends to be biased in how it processes and remembers information, especially when we are motivated to reach a particular conclusion. So we realized that we couldn't rely on our own minds to remember what our original analysis plan was. So we circumvent this bias by recording our plan ahead of time, so we know for sure which analyses we planned and which were data dependent. And so as a lab, we have created this experiment archive form. It's publicly available on the link at the bottom of the screen. It might be useful for adapting to other research areas. So the first, there are different sections to this form that researchers fill out as they go through the different stages of the research process. This first section is for study planning, where, for example, you can specify things like your planned total sample size and any rationale for that sample size. A priori inclusion and exclusion criteria that we want to set ahead of time. And any a priori analyses that we plan to run. So section 2 is filled out right at the close of data collection, where, for example, we list the name of the project, exactly where where the study took place and where our consents are stored, and information about timing and research assistance. And then section 3 is a study summary that we complete after we've done our main analyses. So we list things like key variables, our main research question, and a summary of the results. So each section of this form takes a few minutes to fill out, but this saves us an immense amount of time in the long run. This form goes in a folder with a carefully labeled syntax file and a carefully labeled data file, stored in a centralized location on our lab drive. This means that when we come back to data next month or a few years from now, or we want to share our data with a collaborator, we don't have to struggle to find that file that exactly reproduces the numbers that are in our manuscript, right? We don't have to try to figure out which file version is actually the final version. Was it the one that we called _final or the one that we called _final all capitals? You never know. We know now. Okay, so the StartLocal approach has at least 2 clear benefits. The first is that our own research gets better, and it gets better right away. So we don't have to wait for experts to agree on field-wide standards. We can start right now by making small changes at improving our own local practices. So here's just one example of what starting local has gotten us. So study 1 was the first study that I ran in graduate school. And a painfully oversimplified version of the project is essentially I was interested in whether that blue bar was lower than the red bar. You'll have to trust me that this was actually a really interesting research question. And in study 1, it was. So that was pretty cool. But for study 2, we thought, okay, let's try tweaking some aspects of the scenario that we used in study 1 that we think shouldn't matter for reproducing this result. In other words, let's conduct a systematic replication. So we were expecting to see the same pattern of results, and in study 2, we didn't. The effect entirely went away, or if anything, it's slightly reversed. So as you can imagine, at this point, I was sort of questioning my decision to go to graduate school. This was the second study I ever ran. Okay, but because we were using these better practices, we knew that these were both highly powered studies, and so we trusted both sets of results. So instead of giving up on the project, we went back and looked at our materials to see if maybe we had changed something that might be more meaningful. And we went back into the literature and looked for potentially theoretically derived moderators, right? Another variable that might explain why we get two different patterns of results. We found one that seemed promising, and we designed a third study to manipulate that moderator and see if we could reproduce this discrepancy. And that's exactly what we did. So in the first condition of the moderator, you see a pattern of results that looks a lot like study 1. And in the second condition of the moderator, you see a pattern that looks a lot like study 2. Now, studies 4, 5, and 6 in the same manuscript provided both direct and conceptual replications of this result. Now, this moderator is really new and interesting and theoretically generative, and we never would have found it if we weren't using these local better practices. So starting local has allowed us to save time and resources, to go on fewer wild goose chases, to have fewer inconclusive studies. We trust our data more, and we get to learn more from the work that we do. So not only does our own research get better right away, but using this bottom-up approach of starting in our own lab, or maybe with your own group of graduate students, allows us to accumulate knowledge about what works and what doesn't work within different research contexts. And then we can use this knowledge to help us inform the development of field-wide standards that are appropriately nuanced. So the better that we understand what works from the bottom up and listen to other people who might have different experiences than us, the better able we'll be as a field and as a science to develop standards and practices that are effective across different research landscapes. So I wanted to say thank you to Allison and all of our collaborators on all of these method-related projects in our lab. And I wanted to leave you guys with some other locally grown resources. And thank you.